Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Yesterday, I talked about John Bell Hood and his connection to the Texas fort that bore his name for the better part of a century. I am still a little hung up on Hood. I wanted to find out more about his life, how he moved from Kentucky to Texas and his connection to the Confederate Army. And I remember that he had done a book. It was published, it was his autobiography, published in the early 1880s. It's called Advance and Retreat, Personal Experiences in the United States and Confederate States Armies. And in the book, he talks about that transition from the US Army to the Confederate Army. And it's pretty interesting. He gives away a little bit of his motivation for resigning his officer's commission and leaving the United States for the Confederate States. And he also talks about his encounters along the way with certainly one name you know, Robert E. Lee. So I want to get into this for you and read a couple of passages which gives you a sense of Hood's journey as he's making this transition after the states began to secede. In fact, before the states begin to secede. So let me take you back to November of 1860. So here we go. In November 1860, I was granted a leave of absence for 6 months, and on my arrival in Indianola, I received an order directing me to report for duty as Chief of Cavalry at West Point. I immediately proceeded to Washington and made application in person to Colonel Sam Cooper, Adjutant General, to be relieved from the order and allowed to avail myself of the leave of absence already granted. I shall ever remember the astonishment of this old and most worthy soldier at my unwillingness to go to West Point. He, that's Cooper, turned quickly in his chair, saying, "Lieutenant, you surprise me. This is a post and position sought by almost every soldier." I replied it was true, but I have feared war would soon be declared between the states, in which event I preferred to be in a situation to act with entire freedom. He acceded to my request. Before the expiration of my leave of absence, hostilities were inaugurated and my resignation was tendered to the United States government. So in this passage, remember, it's November 1860. The presidential election is happening. Abraham Lincoln is elected. The following month, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede. And so Hood is arriving in Washington at a really unique time as the election of Lincoln is going to precipitate the secession crisis. And another note to add here is Cooper, who is astonished and says so when the offer to be Chief of Cavalry at West Point is declined. Cooper himself also joins the Confederacy and becomes the senior general, even ahead of Lee. So interesting moments in time there. So I want to continue reading this and give you a greater sense of what happens when he goes down to Richmond. So let me continue. Shortly before the secession of the Southern states, I returned to Camp Wood and, although still on leave, accompanied my regiment to Indianola, where I bid my comrades a reluctant farewell. Kentucky being the land of my nativity, I deemed it right I should first tender my services for her defense. Accordingly, I went to Louisville in the early spring of 1861 and subsequently to Frankfort. I met the governor, Mr. Breckinridge, it's now the former vice president and U.S. senator, and other prominent men of that commonwealth. But after long debate and considerable delay, I became convinced that no decided action would be taken. Of course, as you all know, Kentucky is in the midst, it's in the throes of debating whether or not to be in the Confederacy or to stay in the Union. That, of course, would be ultimately decided. So he says, I repaired, continuing the passage, I repaired at the latter part of April to Montgomery, Alabama, offered my services to the Confederate government, was appointed first lieutenant in the Army, that's the Confederate Army, and ordered to Richmond to report to Colonel R.E. Lee, who had very recently assumed command of all the troops in Virginia by authority of the governor of that state. Hood continues, during my long service in Texas, I had had occasion to visit almost every portion of that extensive and beautiful territory, and was able to form an idea of the future prosperity of that state. So deeply impressed had I become with its vast and undeveloped resources that I had, just prior to the war, determined to resign and make it my home for life. Therefore, when Kentucky failed to act, I entered the Confederate service from the state of Texas, which thenceforth became my adopted land. So there's the connection to Texas and eventually Fort Hood. Anyway, he continues. I arrived in Richmond about the 5th of May, this is 1861, and sent my luggage to the hotel and proceeded without delay to the office of Colonel Lee, who had, I was informed, been recently promoted to the rank of Major General. He extended me a most cordial greeting and, taking me by the hand, said, I am glad to see you. I want you to help me. I replied that I came to Richmond with that object and inquired what duties he desired me to perform. Lee answered, I wish you to go to Yorktown and report to Colonel Magruder. That's John Magruder. I naturally asked at what time he desired me to leave. He turned his head, looked at the clock, and with a smile, said he would like me to go before I dined. It was then about 11 a.m., and I well knew he meant early dinner. I went immediately to the Ballard House, that's his hotel, ordered my trunk to the station, and left for Yorktown. And thus began the Confederate service of Lieutenant and later General John Bell Hood. So that's it for today. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.